When I was 57, my only son sold my house right out from under me, packed up his wife, and moved 2 states away. They left me exactly $150 and a note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "You will figure it out." 15 years on, my grandson looked up my name for a college assignment and rang me sobbing. Inside of 12 hours, I was staring at 200 missed calls from the same son who discarded me like I was nothing. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where patience wins and the truth always finds its way home. Before we get into today's story, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever been written off by someone who was supposed to love you? Drop a word in the comments, even just a yes or a no. It means more than you know. Now, a quick note. Some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio experience, and any resemblance to specific real people is purely coincidental. What matters is the message at the heart of it. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not stopped since noon. I lifted the device, feeling the cold metal press against my calloused hands, hands that had labored without rest for decades to construct a life that my own flesh and blood had once stolen from me. I swiped the screen and answered, raising the phone to my ear without uttering a single word. Ragged, uneven breathing poured through the speaker. Then a voice split the silence. Young, unsteady, strangled with tears. "Grandpa." The word struck me like a fist to the chest. It was Mason. The last time I had laid eyes on my grandson, he was a 7-year-old boy digging in the dirt of my backyard, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal his parents were engineering inside that house. I held my silence, letting the crushing weight of 15 years of absence settle in the space between us. "Grandpa, please do not hang up," Mason pleaded, his voice fracturing. "I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know anything. I was writing a research paper for my university business class today. My professor told us to profile leading philanthropists in the biotech industry. I searched your name on Google just to see if you were somehow still out there. A Forbes magazine article came up. The biotech billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that actually you?" I closed my eyes and drew a slow, measured breath. The quiet of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt completely cut off from the storm erupting on the other end of the line. "Yes, Mason," I said at last, my voice steady, carrying the full gravity of a 72-year-old man who had survived absolute ruin. "It is me." A harsh sob ripped from the young man's throat. Mason was 22 now, but in that moment he sounded like a lost, devastated child. "They told me you abandoned us." He wept, the words pouring out in a desperate, stumbling rush. "Mom and Dad told me you ran off with some woman, that you drained the family money and left us with nothing. But the article says you built your company from scratch 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Mason," I replied calmly. "They chose to take everything I had, and they chose to lie to you about it. I rebuilt my life from the ashes they left me standing in. I did not run away. I survived them." I could hear Mason weeping, the devastating reality of his parents' true character crashing down on him. But before another question could form, the audio on his end went abruptly muffled. A sudden, chaotic scramble broke out. I heard a door bang open, followed by a sharp gasp from Mason. "Give me that phone." A hard, demanding voice cut through from the background. A brief struggle followed, the scrape of plastic against skin. Then the line dropped for just a fraction of a second before a new voice came through the receiver. It was Derek, my son. The man who had looked me in the eye 15 years ago smiled and quietly sold the roof above my head. "Dad?" Derek's voice was frantic, breathless, but underneath the performed panic, I could hear the unmistakable, nauseating pitch of pure greed. "Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we have been searching for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone tightened, but my pulse did not quicken. No fear, no sudden flood of fatherly feeling, only a cold, exact clarity. The son who had thrown me away like a broken tool was now desperate to reach me. Not because he had missed his father, but because he had just learned his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something." Derek begged, his voice soaked in a cloying manufactured desperation. "My company is in serious trouble. We are facing a massive crisis. And when Mason showed us that article, I could not believe what I was reading. You have to tell me where you are. We are family, Dad. You have to save us." I listened to his frantic breathing, picturing the panic and greed contorting his face. He was holding out for a lifeline, waiting for the forgiving, naive father he had discarded 15 years ago to come rushing back to pull him free. But that man was gone. They had finished him off the day they pressed a crumpled 150 into my hands. I drew the phone away from my ear, hovered my thumb above the glowing red icon, and tapped it. The call ended with a sharp, definitive click. I set the phone back down on the polished walnut desk, and the room returned to total undisturbed silence. The first move had been his, the next one would be mine. Picture coming home from your wife's funeral to find the locks changed, your belongings cleared out, and a crumpled 150 on the porch alongside a note from your only son that read, "You will figure it out." I did figure it out. For 15 years, they had assumed I crawled into a corner somewhere to disappear. But the day before, my 22-year-old grandson had typed my name into a search engine for a college paper and stumbled onto a billion-dollar secret. Within 12 hours, my phone was buried under 200 missed calls from the very people who had discarded me like garbage. The screen of my smartphone cut through the pitch-black darkness of my private study, throwing a cold, pale wash of light over the polished walnut desk. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline burned like scattered diamonds, a sharp contrast to the dark tide of memory surging through my mind. The phone was buzzing again, relentless and frantic, threatening to shake itself right off the desk. I settled back in my high-backed chair, perfectly still, watching the notifications mount. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not let up since noon. I picked up the phone, the cold metal pressing into my calloused hands that had toiled for decades to raise up a life that my own flesh and blood had once taken from me. I swiped the screen and connected, lifting the receiver to my ear without a single word. Ragged, broken breathing filled the line. Then a voice cut through the silence, young, trembling, thick with tears. "Grandpa!" The word hit me like a blow to the chest. It was Mason. The last time I had seen my grandson, he was a 7-year-old boy out in the backyard, dirt completely blind to the monstrous betrayal being arranged inside the house. I stayed quiet, letting the leaden weight of 15 years apart settle between us. "Grandpa, please do not hang up," Mason pleaded, his voice breaking into a sob. "I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know a thing. I was working on a research paper for my university business class today. My professor assigned us to profile top philanthropists in the biotech industry. I put your name into the search bar just to see if maybe you were still alive somehow. The Forbes magazine article came up. The biotech billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that really you?" I shut my eyes and let out a long, measured breath. The stillness of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt sealed off entirely from the chaos breaking loose on the other end of the line. "Yes, Mason," I finally said, my voice composed, bearing all the weight of a 72-year-old man who had come through total devastation. "It is me." A harsh sob ripped from the young man's throat. Mason was 22, but right then he sounded like a lost and broken child. "They told me you abandoned us." He cried, his words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "Mom and Dad said you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and walked away, leaving us with absolutely nothing. But the article said you started your company from scratch 15 years ago. It said you were left without a home. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Mason," I answered evenly. "They chose to strip me of everything I had, and they chose to deceive you about it. I reconstructed my life from the wreckage they left me in. I did not flee. I outlasted them." I could hear Mason weeping as the full, shattering picture of who his parents truly were came collapsing down on him. But before he could form another question, the audio on his end went violently muffled. A sudden scramble erupted. I heard a door slam hard, followed by Mason's sharp gasp. "Give me that phone," a harsh, commanding voice barked from the background. I could hear Camille shouting somewhere behind him, demanding he put it on speaker. A brief struggle followed, the scrape of plastic dragged against skin, and then the line went silent for a fraction of a second before a new voice came on. It was Derek, my son. The man who had met my eyes 15 years ago smiled and quietly sold the roof from over my head. "Dad?" Derek's voice was frantic and breathless, but underneath the manufactured urgency, the unmistakable, sickening frequency of absolute greed rang through. "Dad, is that really you?" "Oh my God, we have been looking for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone tightened, but my heart rate did not spike. No fear, no sudden surge of paternal feeling, only a cold, precise clarity. The son who had cast me aside like a broken tool was now desperate to reconnect. Not because he had missed his father, but because he had just discovered that his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something," Derek begged, his voice soaked in a sickly manufactured desperation. "My company is in trouble. We are staring down a massive financial crisis. And when Mason showed us that article, I could not believe what I was reading. You have to tell me where you are. We are a family, Dad. You have to save us." I listened to his ragged breathing, picturing the panic and greed twisting his face. He was holding out for a lifeline, counting on the forgiving, guileless father he had left behind 15 years ago to come sprinting back to his rescue. He genuinely believed that time and blood would wipe away the memory of standing alone in an empty driveway, clutching a pathetic fistful of cash, while the moving truck rounded the corner and disappeared. But that man no longer existed. They had finished him off the day they pressed a crumpled $150 into my hands and told me to figure it out. Now Derek wanted me to bail out his failing real estate business. He wanted the billionaire philanthropist, not the father. I drew the phone from my ear, hovered my thumb over the glowing red icon, and pressed it. The call ended with a sharp, definitive click. I set the phone back down on the polished walnut desk, and the room dropped back into total unbroken silence. The first move had been his. The next one would be mine. The heavy doors of my private boardroom clicked shut, sealing us in. Derek skipped any pretense of pleasantries or hollow apologies. He crossed straight to the long glass table and tossed a thick-bound portfolio across its surface. It skidded to a stop directly in front of me. I looked at the portfolio, then up at the man who used to be my son. He wore a tailored suit that did its best to conceal the sweat of desperation gathering at his temples. He planted both hands flat on the glass and leaned across the table, demanding a $2 million loan to rescue his sinking real estate development firm. He rattled off terms like liquidity crisis and temporary market downturns, trying to project the image of a savvy operator negotiating from strength. But the panic in his eyes told the real story. He was going under, and he expected me to be the thing that kept him afloat. I settled back in my seat, hands still in my lap, and let him talk. No interruptions. I simply watched the breathtaking audacity play out in front of me. Then Camille weighed in. She was seated beside him, in an expensive silk dress purchased on someone else's dime, legs crossed with a rehearsed elegance that turned my stomach. She leaned forward, her tone starting out slick and saccharine, before pivoting sharply into accusation. She looked me straight in the eye and said that while the loan was the priority, we also needed to discuss Mason. She had the nerve to tell me that growing up without a grandfather had taken a serious toll on my grandson. According to her version of events, my sudden disappearance 15 years ago had left a deep psychological void in Mason's life. In her telling, I was the one who had walked away. She sat there in my room and demanded that I immediately establish a substantial trust fund for Mason to make up for my absence during his childhood. The sheer shamelessness of it hung thick in the air. These were the two people who had maneuvered me into signing over my power of attorney while I was paralyzed with grief over my late wife. These were the people who liquidated my home, loaded up their things, and vanished across state lines, leaving me with a single crumpled $100 bill of $50 and a note telling me to figure it out. Now, they were working to rewrite the entire history, recasting themselves as the abandoned victims of a negligent father. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl the portfolio back at them. The rage living inside me was not a burst of flame. It was a cold, slow-moving glacier. I studied the $2 million proposal, then looked at Camille, then at Derek. I let the silence expand 10, maybe 15 seconds. I furrowed my brow, slightly released a quiet sigh, deliberately performing the hesitation of a tired and guilty old man, genuinely wrestling with the burden of his past. I made it look like I was actually weighing their demands. That hesitation was a trap, and Derek walked straight into it. Patience had never been his strength, and desperation had stripped away whatever thin pretense of composure he had left. He drove his fist down onto the glass table. The crack of it rang through the room. His face went a deep, furious red, and the mask of the struggling but reasonable businessman shattered completely. He leveled a shaking finger at me, his voice climbing into an ugly, entitled rage. He told me to stop playing games. He shouted that I was 72 years old with no earthly use for billions of dollars. He said I was just an old man sitting alone in a penthouse while my real family was out there fighting to survive. He leaned close enough that I could see the pulse hammering in his neck, and he spat out the words that sealed his fate for good. He told me I owed them this money. He said I owed them for vanishing all those years ago and leaving them to fend for themselves. That was the moment, the final drop, that sent the glass over the edge. He actually believed his own fabrications. He believed that because I had held my silence for 15 years, I was weak. He mistook my patient observation for surrender. I looked at his red, contorted face, and I no longer saw my son. I saw a parasite that had finally exhausted every last host. I kept my face completely blank, holding the lethal response I was about to deliver perfectly in check. The tension inside the private boardroom was thick enough to suffocate. Derek was still draped over the glass table, his face burning with entitlement and panic, waiting for me to simply hand across $2 million and save his drowning enterprise. Before I could say a word, the heavy double doors of the boardroom blew open with a violent crash, striking the wall so hard the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Standing in the doorway, chest heaving, eyes wide with frantic urgency, was Mason. He looked as though he had run the entire way from his university campus. His backpack slid from his shoulder and hit the floor with a heavy thud. He did not so much as glance in my direction, his tear-filled gaze locked entirely onto his parents. "Mason, what are you doing here?" Derek snapped, his voice dropping in an octave as he tried to paper over his raw desperation with a thin coat of parental authority. Camille rose immediately, smoothing her expensive silk dress, her practiced smile faltering as she extended a hand toward him. Mason ignored it entirely. He stepped further into the room, breathing hard. "You lied to me?" he said, his voice trembling but gathering force with each word. "My entire life, you told me he abandoned us. You said he ran off with some mistress and emptied the family accounts." Camille's face went white. She cut a nervous glance at me, then back at her son. "Sweetheart, please, we can work through this at home. This is not the time or place. Your father and I are here conducting very important business." "Business." Mason let out a short, bitter, broken laugh. "You are here begging him for money, the man you called a selfish coward, the man you said left us to starve. I read the articles on the way over here. I checked the dates. He lost everything the exact same month we moved into that big house in the suburbs. You stole from him. You took everything he had." The air was sucked out of the room in an instant. Derek's face twisted into something ugly and cornered. Every trace of the struggling but respectable real estate developer evaporated, replaced by a trapped and vicious animal. "Shut your mouth!" Derek roared. He crossed the gap between himself and his son in 2 strides and raised his hand. The slap was deafening. The sharp crack of flesh on flesh rang off the high ceiling of the boardroom. Mason staggered back, his hand shooting up to his rapidly reddening cheek, eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Camille gasped, but did not move an inch toward her son. She stood frozen, undone by the collapse of her own lies. I did not think. I just moved. At 72 years old, you might expect my reflexes to have dulled, but a grandfather's protective instinct has no regard for age. Before Derek could raise his hand to strike his son a second time, I planted myself squarely between them. I drove Derek back with a force that caught us both off guard, sending him stumbling into the sharp edge of the glass table. "Do not ever put your hands on him again," I said, my voice dropping to a low and lethal whisper. The room went completely still. Derek stared at me, rubbing his chest, where I had shoved him, breathing hard, his eyes darting in every direction. "You have no right to get involved," he spat, jabbing a trembling finger at me. "He is my son. You do not get to walk back into our lives after 15 years and tell me how to handle my own child." I held my ground, keeping Mason sheltered behind my shoulder. I could feel the young man tremble, but he did not step away from me. I looked at the man I had raised. In that precise moment, the very last trace of parental forbearance drained out of me entirely. The hesitant, guilty old man they believed they were working was gone. Standing in his place was someone who had survived absolute ruin and constructed a billion-dollar empire from nothing. I looked at Derek not with anger, but with a chilling and ruthless clarity. The time for watching was finished. It was time to spring the trap. I straightened the cuffs of my suit jacket, deliberately puncturing the tension with a terrifying glacial composure. I drew a slow breath and let my gaze move from Derek's furious face to Camille's pale, hungry eyes. "You are absolutely right," I said, allowing the words to sit heavily in the air. I owe you both precisely what you deserve for the past 15 years. Derek's hand dropped slowly to his side. His breathing steadied as the word "owe" triggered the parasitic greed hardwired into him. His rage was instantly overtaken by his desperate appetite for my wealth. I moved back to my high-backed chair, completely composed, and regarded them both. Tomorrow night, my foundation is hosting our annual charity gala downtown. I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who holds every card. Every major investor media outlet and industry leader in the city will be there. It is the most significant event of the year for my company. I want you both in attendance. Dress well. Do not be late. Mason will be there as my personal guest. Derek and Camille exchanged a rapid, calculating look. He swallowed hard, his earlier fury dissolving entirely into a starving, desperate anticipation. "And the loan," Derek pressed, his voice shaking with renewed hope. "The 2 million. I held his greedy, hollow gaze and gave him a slow, measured nod. "Tomorrow night, I will take the stage," I told him evenly. "In front of everyone in that room, I will make a formal announcement regarding my successor and the future of my entire fortune. Show up, and you will receive exactly what is coming to you." Derek's eyes blazed with a blinding, toxic ambition. A smug, satisfied smile spread slowly across Camille's face. They genuinely believed they had won. They had swallowed the bait completely, hook, line, and sinker, with no idea whatsoever that they were marching straight into their own undoing. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing away the frantic, desperate energy Derek had dragged into the room. I was alone again. The silence of the penthouse boardroom settled back in the thick and absolute, a stark contrast to the wreckage of the family scene that had just played out in front of me. I did not sink into my high-backed chair. I did not rub my temples or let a single tear fall for the broken relationship with my son. That grief had been buried 15 years ago. All that remained now was the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had just invited a parasite to a feast. I reached for the intercom on my desk and pressed the button. "Send Graham in," I said. My voice was steady, emptied of any lingering feeling. Within 60 seconds, the doors opened again. Graham, my chief legal counsel and head of corporate intelligence, entered the room. He was a man who moved with quiet efficiency, his expression a flawless mask of professional detachment. He carried a slim leather attaché, which he set carefully onto the glass table, at the exact spot where Derek had slammed his fist only minutes before. "You asked me to dig into his company," Graham said, clicking the case open. "I did not just dig Vincent, I brought out the heavy machinery." He withdrew a substantial stack of confidential financial records, bank statements, and court filings, and spread them across the table. I surveyed the sea of paperwork. Derek had believed he could walk into my office, toss around industry buzzwords, and sell me on a fabricated story about a temporary liquidity crisis. He and his wife had genuinely assumed that the man who built a global biotechnology empire from absolute scratch would simply hand over $2 million without conducting a forensic background check. Graham pressed a manicured finger against a spreadsheet flagged in bright red ink. "Your son is not simply experiencing a market downturn." Graham said, his tone completely flat. "He is broke, and in fact, broke would be a significant upgrade from where he actually stands. Derek is buried under catastrophic criminal debt." I leaned forward, my eyes moving across the heavily redacted documents. "For the past 3 years," Graham continued, "Derek has been operating his real estate development firm as a personal piggy bank. He has been systematically draining funds from his active residential projects to sustain a lavish lifestyle designer, clothes, luxury cars, expensive vacations, all bankrolled with money that was never his. He built a web of fictitious vendor invoices to obscure the trail, but he grew careless." "But that is not the worst of it," Graham said, drawing a secondary file from the slim leather attaché. The file bore a federal seal near the top margin. 2 months ago, a group of private investors caught the irregularities in his quarterly reports. They retained a forensic accounting firm. The auditors found a gaping hole in his corporate accounts. Derek has embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He is currently the subject of an active covert investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The pieces snapped into place with crystalline clarity, the frantic missed calls, the sudden desperate need to surface after 15 years of silence, the aggressive demand for exactly 2 million. Derek did not want my money to develop new properties. He needed a massive immediate infusion of untraceable cash to quietly seal the wound in his accounts before federal agents broke his front door down. He was cornered, terrified, and hunting for a scapegoat. He believed he could use the father he had discarded as a human shield against a federal indictment. I let out a low, humorless sound. It was a pathetic, breathtaking kind of arrogance. He had put me on the street with $150, fully expecting me to crumble and disappear. Now, staring down the prospect of decades in a federal penitentiary, he expected me to blindly deliver $2 million and rescue him from his own greed. He truly believed I was still the same grieving, naive old man from 15 years ago. Graham gathered the documents and stacked them neatly back into the attaché. He regarded me, his expression grave. "We have ironclad proof of his financial crimes, Vincent," he said quietly. "The wire transfers, the shell companies, the forged signatures. It is all here. Should I contact the authorities now? We can hand this entire package over to the federal investigators and have him taken in before he even makes it home." I rose from my seat and walked slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was coming alive, a sprawling grid of gold and silver light stretching toward the horizon. I looked down at the streets and thought about the charity gala unfolding tomorrow night. I thought about Derek rushing home to tell Camille that they had successfully outmaneuvered the old man, that their salvation was assured. I wanted him to savor that sensation. I wanted him to taste victory. I wanted him to sleep well tonight, dreaming about the billions he believed he was about to inherit. I turned back to Graham and shook my head, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving ice. "No," I said evenly. "Do not call the police. Let him put on his expensive suit. Let him walk the red carpet. Let him climb up to the podium and feel the weight of the golden crown of victory settling on his head. Because a fall from the lowest step is quickly forgotten, Graham. I want him to fall from the very top. Only when he is certain he has won everything will we push him off the edge." The bell above the door of the small corner cafe chimed softly, cutting through the low murmur of the espresso machine. I was sitting in a booth near the back, nursing a black tea, watching the entrance. Mason walked in. He looked completely hollowed out. The dark circles beneath his eyes and his caved-in posture told the story of a young man whose entire world was coming apart at the seams. He spotted me and wound his way through the narrow maze of wooden tables. He dropped into the booth across from me, eyes fixed on the scarred surface of the tabletop. I offered no warm smile, no reassuring hand on the shoulder. This was not a reunion. This was an intervention. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew a small silver flash drive. I set it flat in the center of the table. The metal clinked against the wood, pulling his eyes down to it. I told him that what was stored on that drive was the unvarnished truth about the people who had raised him. I laid it out plainly. His father was not weathering a routine market downturn. Derek had embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He had falsified documents, constructed fictitious vendor accounts, and funneled stolen funds to sustain a life of pure luxury. I told Mason that his parents were not searching for a family reconciliation. They were hunting for a human shield to position between themselves and a federal indictment. Mason stared at the drive as though it were something dangerous. His breathing went shallow. He asked how they could act so recklessly, how lying came so easily to them. I looked at my grandson and told him that lying was the simplest thing his parents had ever done. I asked him to picture a 57-year-old man returning from a cemetery. I had just buried my wife, his grandmother. The house was supposed to be a place of mourning and quiet comfort. Instead, I walked up to the front porch and found the door locked. My key would not turn. I looked through the front window and saw a living room that had been stripped to nothing. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every trace of a life together, gone. I kept my voice perfectly even as I described the raw, breathless panic of that afternoon. I told him about the single envelope sitting on the doormat. Inside was exactly $150 in crumpled bills and a handwritten note from his father. It simply told me to figure it out. They had preyed on my grief. They had maneuvered me into surrendering my assets while my mind was clouded with sorrow and heavy medication. They took my home, my savings, and my only grandson, and they crossed state lines without so much as a backward glance. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the booth. Mason covered his face with both hands. His shoulders convulsed as he fought to hold back the sobs. The full weight of what was true was dismantling him from the inside. The privileged life he had grown up in, the life he had always taken for granted, had been built entirely on the bones of an old man they had abandoned for dead. He whispered that they were monsters. He kept saying it, his voice fracturing with disgust and grief. I did not argue. I let him cry. I let the burn of betrayal scorch away the last illusions he had held onto about his family. It was a hard thing to witness a young man losing his parents while they were still breathing, but a surgeon does not hesitate when the tissue has turned. The infection had to come out. I waited until his breathing evened out, and he finally dragged his sleeve across his eyes. I leaned forward, forearms on the table, and nudged the flash drive a few inches closer to him. I told him that tomorrow night, the whole city would have its eyes on the charity gala. I told him his parents would be seated in the front row, dressed in clothes bought on my stolen credit, waiting to be anointed heirs to my empire. Then I gave him a mission. I told Mason that right before I walked onto the stage, he needed to take that flash drive and move toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom. I told him to look for a tall man in a dark gray suit standing near the service doors. He was to hand the drive directly to that man and no one else. Mason looked up at me, eyes wide and raw. He asked who the man in the gray suit was. I did not answer. Instead, I told him that for his entire life, his parents had made his choices for him. They had decided what he believed, who he trusted, and what kind of world he inhabited. But tomorrow night, the choice was his alone. I told my grandson he had to pick a side. He could take the drive, walk away, and stand with the people who had constructed their lives on theft and deception. Or he could hand it over and stand with the truth. I lifted my black tea, took a final sip, and rose from the booth. I looked down at the young man wrestling with the hardest decision he had ever faced. Mason extended a trembling hand, his fingers closing tightly around the cold metal of the drive. He looked up at me and gave one slow, firm nod. The battle lines were drawn. The grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was a glittering wash of crystal and cascading camera light. It was the night of my foundation's annual charity gala, the absolute pinnacle of the city's corporate and social calendar. Out on the sprawling red carpet that fed into the main hall, a full media circus was already running at full speed. Camera flashes popped like bursts of lightning, illuminating the height of my son's arrogance in sharp relief. Derek and Camille were planted at the center of the frenzy, basking in a spotlight they had done nothing to earn. They carried themselves like royalty, draped in the kind of ostentatious luxury that can only be purchased with someone else's money. Derek wore a bespoke charcoal tuxedo that fit him without a wrinkle. Camille stood at his side in a stunning floor-length sapphire gown, her neck and wrists heavy with diamonds. I knew the precise cost of those outfits because the fraud alerts from my corporate credit accounts had been stacking up on my phone all afternoon. They had spent without restraint, treating my name and my credit line as their own private reserve. They were parading through the spoils of their anticipated victory, completely blind to the fact that every diamond, every thread of that silk was just another count in the legal case being built against them. I stood alone on the curved second-floor mezzanine, tucked back in the soft shadows, watching the spectacle below us. The acoustics of the grand hall carried their voices up to me with flawless clarity. A local financial reporter thrust a microphone toward Derek, asking about his sudden appearance in the city and his connection to my biotech empire. Derek produced a practiced, disarmingly polished smile. He drew Camille in close with an arm around her waist, presenting the image of a devoted family man for the cameras. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice wrapped in a sickening, carefully calibrated humility. "My father is a brilliant man," Derek said smoothly, sweeping his gaze across the assembled press. "He has constructed something truly extraordinary here, but he's getting older, and the weight of running a global company is wearing on him. I am here to step up. I am here to take on that responsibility so he can finally rest. It is my duty as his son to carry this forward and to look after him in his final years. He has given so much to the world. Now it is time for his family to give something back to him." Camille nodded at his side, pressing a manicured hand to her heart, performing the role of the devoted, loving daughter-in-law with practiced precision. I tightened my grip on the cold marble railing of the balcony. The sheer, undiluted poison of his words was almost something to admire. He stood there soaking up the admiration of the press, casting himself as the loyal heir rushing to the aid of his aging father. This was the same man who had left me with $150 and a note telling me to figure it out. The same man currently under active investigation by federal agents for embezzling $4 million from his own investors. He was delivering the performance of his life, stacking his pedestal higher and higher, inflating his own mythology until it swallowed the entire room. That was precisely what I wanted. I wanted him to feel the full, intoxicating weight of absolute power. Then, a sharp-eyed journalist from a major business publication glanced upward and caught me standing on the mezzanine. A ripple moved through the crowd as dozens of heads turned. The camera flashes redirected, finding my face in the shadows. Derek followed their gaze and looked up at me. That practiced charming smile of his slipped for just a heartbeat, a flicker of nervous energy darting across his eyes before he caught himself, and looked back up at me with a wide manufactured grin. "Mr. Vincent the journalist," called out his voice, carrying through the lofty ceilings of the grand hall. "Your son just spoke about where the company is headed. Will you be stepping away tonight? Are you officially passing the torch and naming him your successor?" Every sound in the ballroom died at once. Hundreds of eyes, including the hungry, desperate eyes of my son and his wife, locked entirely onto me. They were waiting for the validation they believed they had so cleverly engineered. They were waiting for me to publicly hand my life's work over to their grasping, greedy hands. I set my palms on the railing and looked straight down at Derek. I let the silence breathe, let his anticipation climb until it was almost unbearable. Then I gave him a slow, composed smile that revealed absolutely nothing. Tonight is a very special night. I projected my voice cutting clearly across the room so that every reporter, every investor, and every guest present could hear each word. It is a night about legacy, about truth, and about what comes next. I have reached my decision regarding the fate of this company and my fortune, and I promise you, everything will be given to the one who has truly earned it. The reporters burst into excited chatter, scribbling furiously and raising their cameras. Down in the front row, Derek's eyes blazed with a blinding euphoric triumph. Camille exhaled audibly, a long, slow breath of relief, her manufactured smile stretching wide across her face. They took my words and filtered them through the lens of their own towering narcissism. They were utterly convinced they had claimed the ultimate prize. They had no idea the curtain was about to rise on their complete and total destruction. The heavy satin curtain swept open, and I stepped out onto the main stage of the grand ballroom. The fierce intensity of the theatrical spotlight struck me at once, washing the sea of faces into a blur and casting a brilliant, blinding glow across the podium. As I moved towards center stage, the low, buzzing hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations began to die away. The clinking of crystal flutes and the soft shuffle of expensive shoes fell completely silent until a thick, expectant hush settled over the entire hall. This was the moment the city's elite had been waiting for all evening. I adjusted the microphone, the metallic scrape ringing out sharply across the room. I looked down into the audience. The harsh stage lighting reduced the back rows to dark, shapeless silhouettes. But the front row was lit perfectly, standing dead center, practically pressing against the satin rope that separated the stage from the crowd, were Derek and Camille. They were nearly trembling with anticipation. Derek had popped open his suit jacket and shifted his weight forward, coiled like an athlete waiting for the starting gun. He stared up at me with wide, unblinking eyes, a tight, arrogant smile fixed across his face. He had already lifted one hand to his chest, casually straightening his designer silk tie, physically rehearsing the moment he would climb those steps and accept his coronation. Camille stood shoulder to shoulder with him, her manicured hands clasped tightly together at the front of her floor-length sapphire gown, gazing up at me with an expression of breathless, manufactured devotion. They were so entirely consumed by their own bottomless greed that they never noticed the cold, hollow, utterly unyielding look in my eyes. I leaned into the microphone, my voice ringing out deep and steady, commanding the complete attention of every person in that room. 15 years ago, I said, letting the words hang in the heavy air. 15 years ago, I stood on a bare driveway with nothing but the clothes on my back. No home, no family, exactly $150 to my name. A soft, captivated murmur moved through the crowd of investors and journalists. They loved this story. To them, it was the ultimate American underdog tale, the visionary founder who rose from the rubble of personal tragedy to build a biotechnology empire. Down in the front row, Derek's smile widened. He nodded slowly, playing the devoted son, assuming this was simply the dramatic setup for his grand introduction. I built this company on a foundation of pure survival. I continued keeping my gaze fixed directly on Derek. I spent the past decade and a half securing the future, developing innovations that change lives, and building a legacy of extraordinary wealth. But true legacy is not simply what you construct. It is what you leave behind and, more importantly, who you leave it to. The tension in the ballroom climbed to a fever pitch. The cameras flashed in a rapid-fire strobe capturing the historic moment. Derek took a half step forward, his polished leather shoes pushing up against the satin rope. He was ready. He was waiting for his name. Tonight I announced I am declaring the final irrevocable disposition of my entire estate. My voice dropped to a sharp, lethal register. Effective immediately, 100% of my corporate equity, my voting rights, my real estate holdings, and my personal liquid assets are being permanently transferred into a newly established ironclad legal entity. Derek's chest swelled. He glanced sideways at the journalists, already bracing to absorb their envy. I am officially launching the $150 trust, I declared, raising my voice over the room. Derek blinked. That arrogant smile froze where it sat. A flicker of deep, genuine confusion moved through his eyes. Camille's clasped hands slowly dropped to her sides. This foundation, I went on, projecting over the sudden, confused whispering rising through the crowd, is dedicated exclusively to the protection and rehabilitation of elderly individuals who have suffered severe financial abuse. It will provide full legal and financial firepower against the predators who prey on the vulnerable. Specifically, it is designed to pursue and prosecute family members, the sons and daughters who manipulate, discard, and rob the very parents who brought them into this world. The ballroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The cameras stopped flashing. The assembled elite stared up at the stage in pure, unguarded shock. I looked down at the front row. The color had drained entirely from Derek's face. He looked like a man who had just been pushed from a plane with no parachute. His mouth hung slightly open, his breathing shallow and fast. Camille looked as though she might be physically sick. Let me be perfectly clear so that no confusion remains about the future of my empire. I said, driving the final nail home with surgical precision. My wealth belongs to the forgotten. It belongs to the betrayed. It will fund a fortress for those left out in the cold. There are no corporate heirs. There will be no generational wealth transfer. Not a single cent of my fortune will ever pass to my bloodline. The shockwave that tore through the ballroom was instantaneous. A collective audible gasp rose from the crowd. Down in the front row, the carefully polished facade of the loving son shattered completely and violently. The reality of what had just happened crashed into Derek, breaking something in him all at once. The billions he had already spent inside his head evaporated like smoke. The public humiliation finished what the shock had started. He lurched forward, seizing the satin rope with both hands, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the hundreds of powerful people witnessing every second of it. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice shrieking off the grand walls. He yelled that I was losing my mind. He screamed that I was a senile, crazy old man who had no idea what he was doing. His face turned a dark, furious purple as he jabbed a shaking finger straight at me, screaming that I had no right whatsoever to stand up there and strip away what was his. Derek kept screaming, his face a furious shade of red, demanding that someone put a stop to what I was doing. I didn't raise my voice to argue. I didn't signal security to pull him back. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a small black remote. I aimed it toward the control booth at the back of the room and pressed a single button. The massive digital screen behind me flickered. The corporate logo of my biotechnology firm vanished entirely. In its place, a new image lit up the grand ballroom, a high-definition photograph 30 feet tall. It was not a pharmaceutical breakthrough. It was not a blueprint for a new senior care facility. It was a piece of yellowed, torn paper resting beside a crumpled $100 bill and a single $50 bill. The handwriting on the note had been blown up to a massive scale, perfectly legible to every person in that room. It read simply, "You will figure it out." I leaned back into the microphone. My voice was perfectly calm and lethal. I told the audience to look closely at the screen. What they were seeing, I explained, was the entire foundation of my billionaire empire. That I told them was the generous inheritance my only son left me 15 years ago. A wave of confused muttering moved through the crowd. I didn't leave them wondering long. I told that packed ballroom exactly what had happened the week I buried my wife. I described the heavy fog of grief that had completely paralyzed me. I explained how Derek, the man standing right there in the front row, performing the role of devoted son, had approached me while I was heavily medicated and numb with sorrow. He pressed a stack of papers into my hands, telling me they were routine hospital bills and life insurance documents that needed my signature. I trusted my son. I signed every page without reading a single word. I told the crowd how I returned from a walk a few days later to find the locks on my own front door had been changed. The house had been quietly sold out from under me. My son and his wife had gathered their belongings, drained our joint bank accounts, and crossed state lines. They left me standing on that porch with nothing in the world but the clothes on my back, that pitiful handful of cash, and a cold, handwritten note. The silence inside the grand ballroom broke apart. A collective deafening roar of shock and revulsion burst from the hundreds of investors, philanthropists, and journalists packed into that room. The reporters stationed at the edge of the stage immediately understood they had just walked into the biggest corporate scandal of the decade. They swung their cameras away from the podium and trained them directly on the front row. A relentless, blinding volley of camera flashes caught Derek full in the face. He stumbled back, throwing both hands up to shield his eyes. That arrogant, polished bearing he'd carried all evening completely gave way. He looked like a cornered animal, shaking his head and muttering frantically to himself. The wealthy elites and powerful industry figures who had been clinking glasses with him moments earlier quietly stepped back. They retreated, opening a wide, empty ring around Derek and his wife, as though proximity to them had suddenly become dangerous. Derek tried to speak, tried to mount some kind of defense, but the crowd was shouting over him. The public humiliation was total and crushing. The triumphant coronation he had been imagining all night had curdled into a brutal televised execution. Every lie he'd fed the media earlier that evening was now closing around his throat. Camille watched their entire future turn to ash in seconds. The understanding that not a single cent of that billion-dollar fortune was coming to them hit her first, followed immediately by the terror of being destroyed in public. The carefully maintained image of the devoted daughter-in-law dissolved on the spot. Pure, unhinged panic seized her entirely. She lurched forward with a sudden violent burst of energy. She tore a microphone right out of the hands of a stunned financial reporter standing near the satin rope. She gripped it in both fists, knuckles blanching white, and screamed into the device. Her voice shrieked over the grand speakers bouncing off the high ceilings above. She called me a liar. She jabbed her finger toward the stage, her breathing ragged and wild. She screamed to the crowd that they were listening to a crazy, senile old man who was inventing stories for attention. She scrambled to build a new narrative on the fly, shouting that I was the one who had abandoned them. She claimed I had emptied the family accounts and disappeared with a mistress, leaving her and Derek to scrape by in poverty. She pleaded with the journalists to put their cameras down, begging the investors to disregard every word I had said. She was completely unraveling, spinning deeper into a web of desperate, fabricated lies. She drew breath to hurl another accusation, to cast herself as the ultimate victim in this story. But before she could get a single word out, a new voice sliced clean through the chaos. It was young, trembling with raw emotion, amplified through the ballroom sound system. The camera flashes cut off all at once. Every head in that grand hall, including Camille's and Derek's, turned away from the stage and fixed on the heavy service doors at the back of the room. Camille's shrill, frantic voice echoing through the microphone was silenced in an instant. The heavy wooden service doors at the far end of the grand ballroom crashed open with a boom that shuddered through the floorboards. Every camera flash died. Hundreds of powerful investors and sharp-eyed journalists turned as one. Walking down the long center aisle, perfectly caught in the glow of the crystal chandeliers overhead, was Mason. My 22-year-old grandson did not look like the frightened college student who had sat across from me at that small corner cafe just 24 hours before. His shoulders were squared, his jaw was set hard. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stride, aimed straight at the brightly lit stage. Camille froze. She stood near the satin rope, still gripping the stolen microphone, her face drained of a color and slick with nervous sweat. She stared at her son as if she were looking at a ghost. Derek, still reeling from the devastation of his public exposure, turned and locked eyes with Mason. Derek demanded to know what he was doing there. He ordered Mason to leave the room, to go back to the hotel, and stay out of business that didn't concern him. He was reaching for his parental authority, trying to salvage whatever remained of his collapsing empire. But those words landed on completely deaf ears. Mason didn't stop walking. He didn't look at his father. His eyes were fixed entirely on his mother. Mason reached the edge of the stage. He stepped straight over the satin rope, bypassing the security guards entirely. They were too stunned by the unfolding scene to move. He walked directly up to Camille. She forced a shaky, desperate attempt at a motherly smile. She extended a trembling hand and told him to tell these people that the old man was lying. She begged him to support her version, to tell the press everything they had been through. Mason looked down at her. He reached out and took the microphone straight out of her sweating grip. He raised it to his mouth, and his voice rolled out across the vast, silent ballroom. He looked his mother dead in the eye and told her to close her mouth. A collective gasp tore through the elite audience. Reporters scrambled to bring their cameras back up, capturing every agonizing second of this family being torn apart. Camille stumbled backward as if she'd taken a physical blow. Mason turned his back on his mother and faced the sea of journalists. He didn't hesitate for a moment. He told the absolute unvarnished truth. He said his name into the microphone and declared that everything I had just told them was completely true. He told that silent, packed room that his entire life his parents had fed him a sickening, poisonous lie. They told him his grandfather was a coward who drained the family accounts and disappeared. Mason paused, his voice shaking with raw emotion, but he didn't waver. He pointed a finger directly at Derek. He told the crowd that his father was a thief and a fraud. He revealed that, only the day before, he had learned the full truth. He told them how his parents had left his grandfather with no home, and exactly 150 to his name. He explained how they had fled the state and constructed their fraudulent luxury life on the back of a grieving old man. Mason looked at the investors in the front row and told them that his parents hadn't come to this gala to celebrate any legacy. They had come to steal whatever remained of it because their own real estate business was completely bankrupt. They had come to use a 72-year-old man as a human shield against their own catastrophic crimes. The ballroom erupted into absolute total chaos. Journalists shouted questions over one another, their voices merging into a deafening roar. Investors pulled out their phones and frantically called their financial advisors to pull any backing they had tied to Derek. The public execution was complete and flawless. Camille buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically as the reality of prison and poverty crashed over her. But Derek didn't cry. The last thread holding his sanity together snapped entirely. The son he had manipulated, the boy he had controlled his whole life, had just driven a knife through his public image in front of the most powerful people in the city. Pure, uncontained rage blinded Derek completely. He let out a feral, unhinged scream that cut through the noise of the crowd. He lowered his head and charged the stage like a rabid animal. He vaulted over the satin rope, his eyes locked entirely on Mason. He raised his fist, winding back to deliver a violent, devastating blow to his own son, just to make him stop. He wanted to punish the boy for dismantling everything he had built. He wanted to silence the truth by force, but he had completely forgotten who else was standing on that stage. What comes next is the moment everything that was hidden finally breaks into the open, and the man who thought he held all the power discovers exactly how wrong he was. Before we get there, I want to ask you, if someone you loved had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you found out, or would you wait and let the truth do the work? No signal to security, no hesitation. Years of hard survival had turned my reflexes to something close to steel. The moment Derek launched himself at Mason, I cut straight across his path, both palms connected with the middle of his chest, planted deliberate with everything I had. Raw charging force ran headlong into a man with nothing left to protect and nowhere further to fall. Derek's legs buckled underneath him. He reeled back in a wild, stumbling arc, hands grabbing at nothing. The Grand Hotel security unit hit the stage before he could right himself. 6 broad-shouldered guards in dark suits closed the circle around him from every angle. They brought him down in a controlled pile, seizing his arms at the shoulder, and put him face down against the polished hardwood. The crack of impact carried through the open microphone Mason had left lying on the stage floor. Derek bucked and cursed into the floorboards, legs kicking uselessly as the guards locked his wrists behind him. The smooth, commanding executive the world had watched all evening ceased to exist. What remained was a restrained, humiliated criminal, exposed in front of everyone. Every second of my son's unraveling was streaming live to an audience of millions. Yet the evening still had one more card to play. The killing stroke was waiting just off to the side. Through the strobing barrage of camera flashes, the crowd pulled apart a second time, carving out a corridor for what came next. The sound of Derek's body hitting that polished floor had barely faded from the rafters. The guards had every limb pinned and accounted for. Both arms twisted up behind him, his bespoke charcoal tuxedo bunching and splitting at the seams from the pressure of the bodies holding him flat. He fought against them, like something caught in a trap, frantic burning energy with nowhere to go, his cheek grinding into the stage as he struggled for air. Everyone below had gone perfectly still. The power brokers, the money managers, the press they watched without a word, as a man who had considered himself above consequence was reduced to this. Then, from somewhere beyond the edge of the stage, lights a shape moved out of the darkness. Graham, my chief legal counsel. He didn't stride or hurry. His pace was measured almost leisurely, the walk of someone who has already won and simply needs to finish the paperwork. No expression crossed his face. Absolute calibrated calm. Under one arm, he carried a thick craft folder, the kind that holds things that end careers. Stage lighting fell across the folder's cover, and the bold red lettering stamped there stood out clearly. Graham picked his way past the abandoned microphone and came to a stop directly above where Derek lay. Derek strained to lift his face off the floor, sweat running freely, something close to dread beginning to pool in his eyes. He studied Graham, then the folder, and seemed to understand that whatever lived inside it was going to finish him. Graham gave him nothing, not a word, not a gesture of softness. Instead, he opened his fingers. The folder fell. It hit the hardwood beside my son's face with a flat, resonant smack. Pages slid free, fanning out under the lights in a neat, damning spread. The journalists pressed tight against the front of the stage, angled their lenses downward, and started shooting, capturing, among other things, the federal seal sitting prominently at the top of the forensic accounting report. Graham crouched, retrieved the microphone from where Mason had left it, and checked it with a single tap that boomed across the hall. Then he straightened, looked down at Derek, and delivered what he had to say with the clinical detachment of a surgeon closing a wound. He told the room that less than 24 hours earlier, Derek had walked through the door of my private boardroom and demanded a $2 million loan to pull his real estate firm back from the edge. My lawyer's voice carried evenly across every speaker in the building. He told them the story Derek had offered about a brief market correction was fiction from start to finish. The forensic audit in that folder, he announced, established without question that Derek had stolen $4 million from the investors who trusted him. The sound that moved through the audience wasn't just a gasp, it was a physical wave. People who had been warmly shaking Derek's hand an hour earlier stepped back as if the floor near him had become unsafe. Several reached for their phones without a word and began making calls, putting distance between their money and his name. Reporters crouched over the scattered pages, photographing the bank records, the shell company transfers, the fabricated vendor. Invoices, all of it now under bright light. What had been a concealed fraud was now being broadcast in real time. Derek quit fighting. The effort simply left him replaced by something colder and heavier. The knowledge of a man who understands the exit has closed. His gaze moved across the documents fanned out beside his face. The wire transfers, each one highlighted, the precise dates the money had moved. Everything that arrogance and fury had run on the certainty that he could take whatever he wanted, it burned away to nothing. He wasn't the man who had just tried to strike his own son in front of the world. He was a trapped man who had finally run out of lies. Across from him, Camille had dropped to the floor. Both hands clutched the fabric of her floor-length sapphire gown, as the sobs broke through her raw, uncontrolled, because the scale of what had just ended was finally real to her. Every luxury the stolen money had paid for, the homes, the cars, the vision of inheriting a billion-dollar empire, it was ash. What remained was the hard arithmetic of financial ruin and the certainty of what came next behind a locked door. A new sound reached the room, then threading through the silence. Faint at first, a thin wail coming from somewhere out in the city, but it thickened and sharpened fast. Sirens. Police units and federal vehicles were pulling up outside the hotel, their combined pitch cutting through glass and brick and wall. The wailing compounded on itself until the chandeliers seemed to tremble with it. It found Derek's ears, and what little composure remained in him shattered. He threw himself against the guards once more, twisting, kicking, searching by instinct for any gap that might let him move. He screamed that the whole thing was staged, that the documents had been manufactured, but the fear behind the words was naked and impossible to miss. He wrenched against the hands locked around him, eyes swinging toward the back of the room, toward any door that might still be open, not understanding yet that every route out had been sealed before the evening began. Outside, the sirens peaked. The tall brass handles of the main ballroom doors rotated, and the panels swung inward with the weight of what was behind them. The scattered noise of the crowd dropped to nothing like a switch thrown. Uniformed officers spread through the hall in a practiced wave, positioning themselves at exits. They weren't, however, the point of the spear. Out in front of the uniforms came 4 men, dark gray suits, precise and identical in the way only federal agents achieve. They moved in close formation expressions, sealed scanning ahead rather than at the spectacle around them. The gold shields, belts, and lanyards both were impossible to miss. I had been looking for those faces. They were exactly the men I had quietly shown Mason earlier that night. The ones who had been stationed near the service doors, the ones holding the flash drive, every document, every transaction, every thread of proof needed to put my son away in a federal penitentiary for the remainder of his life. The crowd didn't part so much as it dissolved before them. Billionaires and journalists moved out of their way without being asked. The agents looked at no one, acknowledged nothing around them. 4 pairs of eyes aimed at one fixed point on the stage, the man face down on the hardwood. Derek managed to rotate his head enough to see them coming. The moment those gold shields registered in his vision, whatever was left in him gave out completely. His body went slack, his shoulders dropped, and a small broken noise came from somewhere low in his chest. Through the agents, he found Mason at the edge of the stage, and in that instant, everything assembled itself. He understood at last who had passed that flash drive along. The wound of that understanding cut deep, but it reached nothing close to the depth of what he had done to me 15 years ago. The lead agent came up the steps onto the stage shoes, passing over the scattered accounting pages Graham had left behind moments before. A look to the hotel security team. The guards pulled Derek off the floor and up to his knees. The agent stood over my son and brought out a set of steel handcuffs. Then he read the charges aloud in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. Wire fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud investors of $4 million. Each count landed like something structural, giving way another support beam pulled from the fraudulent tower Derek had spent years assembling. And while the agent continued reading, Derek his rights, a sudden desperate movement below the stage dragged my attention downward. Camille had been on her knees in the front row, frozen by the sheer scale of their public collapse. But the moment a federal prison cell stopped being abstract and became something she could see forming in front of her, that paralysis shattered into raw, unhinged terror. The stolen corporate cards, the designer wardrobe, the fleet of luxury cars she grasped in an instant, that all of it was already gone. Her freedom was expiring by the second. She threw herself forward, her expensive sapphire silk dress snagging and ripping on the leg of a stray camera tripod. She clawed her way to the lip of the stage, tears carving black rivers through her carefully constructed makeup. Her face had become something unrecognizable, pure, unmasked panic. She reached up past the satin rope and locked both hands around my pant leg. Her fingers dug into the fabric diamond rings, catching the hard stage light as her whole body trembled. "Dad!" She sobbed, her voice climbing into a shrill, broken pitch. "Dad, please, you have to stop this. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. We can make it right. We'll return the money. Please don't let them take us. We are family. You have to save us. We are your family." She stared up at me with swollen, bloodshot eyes, appealing to the same man she had mocked and stripped bare not many hours before. She was expecting the soft, forgiving old grandfather to materialize out of thin air and throw himself between her and the wreckage she had made. She genuinely believed the word family still carried any meaning between us. I looked down at the woman who had helped architect my destruction. I looked at those hands, the ones that had cheerfully packed my belongings, while I was still raw with grief over my wife. No anger moved through me in that moment, no pity either. What I felt was something cleaner and colder than either of those things. The absolute, undiluted clarity of justice arriving exactly where it belonged. I didn't stoop to comfort her. I didn't offer a single syllable of reassurance. I held her gaze, and with one slow and deliberate motion, drew my leg back until her shaking hands fell away from my suit. She lurched forward, palms slapping the cold stage floor. I looked at her crumpled, weeping face. I leaned in just enough so that my voice would reach her and Derek, but carry no further low enough to be private, sharp enough to leave a permanent mark. I looked at the two people who had burned my past to the ground, and I gave them back their own words. "You will figure it out," I said. The exact phrase they had scrawled on that yellowed note 15 years ago. The same words they had used to abandon me to the street with nothing. Hearing those words come back to her from my mouth shattered whatever remained inside Camille. She folded against the satin rope and buried her face in both hands, wailing in a despair she had no way out of, while the federal agents lifted her husband to his feet and clicked the steel cuffs firmly around his wrists. That small metallic sound, the handcuffs locking into place, cut through the fading wail of sirens outside and seemed to sever the last remaining thread inside Derek. He didn't bow his head. He didn't go quietly. There was no trace of dignity left to offer. Instead, something primal and desperate seized control of him entirely. He wrenched his upper body hard against the agent's grip, ignoring the hands locked around his arms, and turned his furious, bloodshot gaze straight onto his wife. Camille was still crumpled against the satin rope, her floor-length sapphire gown shredded at the hem, mascara streaking in dark lines down her pale face. Derek looked at the woman he had partnered with to ruin my life, and without a moment's pause, he buried her completely. He screamed at the federal agents in a voice splintering with panic. He told them to take her, not him. He insisted he wasn't the one behind it, that Camille had designed the whole scheme from the beginning. He jerked his cuffed wrists toward her and screamed that she was the one who had forced the sale of my house 15 years ago. He told the room, the stunned investors, the journalists with their recorders running, that Camille had personally forged the legal documents and manipulated the power of attorney, while I lay medicated and shattered with grief over my late wife. Watching the betrayal pour out of him was something close to spectacular. He was prepared to hand over the mother of his own child without a breath of hesitation, if it meant even a single month shaved from what was coming for him. Camille stopped crying the moment those words reached her. The despair evaporated, and in its place came something venomous and absolute. The polished society wife was gone. What took her place was a cornered predator with nothing left to protect. She launched herself up from the floor, tearing silk be damned, and drove herself straight toward her husband. A hotel security guard moved fast, seizing her by both shoulders before her hands reached his face. She screamed back at him with everything she had. She told the agents not to believe a word out of his mouth. She called Derek a pathological liar, a coward, a fraud. She pitched her voice out over the chaos of the ballroom, so every journalist and power broker still in the room could hear her announce that Derek had dismantled his own real estate firm through sheer catastrophic incompetence. She screamed that he hadn't lost the money in any market downturn. He had burned through every cent of it on illegal offshore gambling and a mountain of hidden debts he'd concealed from everyone. She openly confessed to the entire room that she had only joined in the recent credit card fraud because Derek had already left them bankrupt and threatened to abandon her with nothing. The immaculate illusion of their charmed, successful marriage was ripped open and laid bare under hundreds of camera flashes. It was an absolute bloodbath, mutual and total. The two of them stood there in the hard stage light, methodically tearing each other to pieces, voluntarily confessing to serious federal crimes, just to guarantee the other one went down alongside them. Like two drowning animals clawing over each other's heads for one more gasp of air. The agents didn't need to ask a single question. They stepped back and let the pair scream their confessions into open microphones, while journalists captured every damning word. Every accusation, every admission went directly into the record and out to the world. The lead agent eventually gave one clean, decisive nod. Two officers stepped in, pulled Camille's arms behind her back, and fastened a second pair of steel handcuffs around her wrists. She kicked and slipped on the polished floor, hurling profanities at Derek as they worked to control her. Derek kept shouting over her voice, cracking, begging loudly for a plea arrangement, and promising full testimony against his wife, as agents dragged him back down the long center aisle of the grand ballroom. The gathered elite stepped aside immediately. Billionaires, industry figures, and media personnel stood in horrified silence as the two people who had glided in, looking like corporate royalty, were removed like something feral and dangerous. The heavy ballroom doors slammed shut behind them, and the sound of their screaming stopped as if a switch had been thrown. The camera flashes guttered out. The charged, suffocating energy that had saturated the room drained away rapidly, leaving something vast and quiet behind. I stood at the center of the stage and looked out across the stunned, silent crowd. I found Graham, my lawyer, below me. He gave me one slow, measured nod of deep respect. I found Mason, my grandson, staring at those closed doors, with hollow eyes quietly absorbing the permanent and irreversible end of the life he had known. The grand hall had gone completely still. The storm that had raged for the last hour had finally broken and passed. The war I had planned and fought in absolute silence was over. My empire was intact. The order I had spent 15 years rebuilding had been restored. The roaring chaos, the cameras, the screaming reporters, the handcuffs, the federal agents marching my son out. All of it was gone now. What was left was the aftermath. Shattered champagne flutes, abandoned cocktail napkins, and the scattered trampled pages of the forensic accounting report, spread across the expensive hardwood floor. The elite guests had melted away as fast as their town cars could remove them, wanting no association with the toxic wreckage of what they had just witnessed. I stood near the edge of the stage, the silence settling heavy across my shoulders, and let my eyes move through the vast, empty hall. There, folded into the dark shadows beneath the grand sweeping staircase, was Mason. My 22-year-old grandson had completely come apart. He was seated on the bottom marble step, elbows on his knees, face pressed into both hands. His shoulders shook with heavy, silent sobs. He had just watched federal agents march his mother and father out of the building toward decades behind bars. He had just stood before the entire world and permanently dismantled the only family he had ever belonged to. I knew precisely what was bearing down on him. It wasn't simply the trauma of what had been revealed. It was the suffocating, vertigo-inducing weight of his new reality snapping into focus. 60 minutes ago, he was the privileged heir to a sprawling real estate fortune, a young man who had never once lost sleep over a tuition bill or a credit card balance. Now, he was the son of 2 federal defendants. His surname was permanently branded with the mark of a massive fraud scandal that had just played out on live television. The imaginary inheritance his parents had dangled over him his whole life was ash. In its place sat a mountain of student loan debt he was now solely responsible for carrying. He owned nothing and stood completely alone. A younger man, a softer version of myself, might have crossed that floor and wrapped his arms around the boy. Might have told him it was going to be fine, that I would handle it, that a large enough check could dissolve the pain. But I had absorbed the brutal lesson that insulating a young man from the consequences of reality doesn't protect him. It hollows him out. That variety of blind, unconditional financial cushioning was precisely what had rotted his father into the man the agents had just dragged away in handcuffs. I had no intention of repeating that error. A few yards off, a hotel janitor had edged his way out of the service corridor, clutching a wide push broom and scanning the room, nervously uncertain whether the scene had cleared enough for him to begin. I walked over, reached out and took the broom from him without a word. Then I turned and moved steadily across the debris-covered floor, my shoes striking a sharp, even rhythm against the hardwood until I was standing directly over Mason. Mason didn't look up. He stayed folded into himself, entirely swallowed by his grief. I didn't crouch to his level. I didn't murmur anything gentle or reassuring. I simply extended the broom and let it go. The handle struck the marble steps with a loud, flat crack and came to rest inches from his polished leather shoes. Mason startled. His hands dropped from his tear-streaked face. He looked at the broom lying there, then raised his head slowly until his eyes, red, swollen full of bewilderment, found mine. "You did a very brave thing tonight, Mason," I said. My voice carried no warmth and no apology, just a clean, firm authority. "You stood up in front of the world and chose the truth over a comfortable, profitable lie. I respect you for that. But crying on the floor of a luxury hotel will not settle your student loans. It will not put food on your table, and it will not begin to repair your reputation." Mason held my gaze, his breath catching in the uneven pulls. He was waiting for the rescue for this billionaire grandfather to uncap a pen and sign away the uncertainty pressing down on him. I looked him straight in the eye and ended that expectation on the spot. "The illusion of your wealth is gone," I told him, gesturing across the ruined, empty ballroom. "Your parents spent their entire lives trying to steal their way to the top because they were genuinely terrified of honest effort. They dressed you well and they trained you to carry yourself like you were above everyone else in the room, but they never once showed you how to actually build something or endure. That education starts now. Pick up the broom, Mason. Start on this mess. Hard work will clear your head faster than anything else. The silence that followed settled between us like something physical. I watched the conflict move across his young, tear-blotched face, his eyes going from the broom to the sprawling wreckage scattered across the ballroom floor and back again. For a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, I thought the entitlement his parents had spent years engineering into him was going to hold. I thought it was going to beat out whatever better instinct was trying to surface. But then Mason dragged the back of his sleeve across his face. He pulled in one long, unsteady breath, reached forward, and closed both hands around the broom handle. He pushed himself upright, standing tall above the debris, and took his first step into it. It was the single hardest thing anyone had ever required of him, and it was the first real lesson in self-reliance that his parents had never seen fit to give him. The morning air was cool and carried pine and fresh earth. A taxi rolled to the curb, and Mason stepped out looking wrung out but oddly clear, steadier in the eyes than he'd been the night before. He had spent every hour since the gala sweeping the grand ballroom floor. The physical labor had scraped away the last residue of his entitled upbringing like paint off old wood. He walked up the short gravel driveway and stopped taking in his surroundings with quiet disbelief. He was standing in front of my actual home, not a compound or a glass tower, a solid, well-kept wooden house tucked into an unassuming corner of a quiet suburb. The lawn was trimmed close, the front porch was modest, and the siding was painted a subdued gray. This was the life I had chosen for myself, away from the blinding excess and corrosive greed of the world he had just watched collapse. I was on the wooden porch swing, a mug of black tea warming my hands, watching him come up the path. Mason climbed the 3 front steps and stood before me. He looked nothing like the entitled heir his parents had been shaping him into. He looked like someone who had just surfaced from a long and very dark place. He kept his gaze on the porch boards for a stretch before lifting his eyes to mine. When he spoke, his voice carried a heaviness built from genuine shame. He said he was deeply sorry for everything his parents had done. He apologized for living comfortably off money that had been taken from me, and for spending his whole life accepting the lies he'd been handed, without ever questioning them. I took a measured sip of tea and gave a slow nod. An apology, I told him, was a reasonable beginning, but words cost nothing. What a man did after he said he was sorry was where character actually revealed itself. Mason shifted his weight, swallowing hard. He told me his entire world had been upended. With his parents headed toward federal prison and every asset they owned frozen by the government, he was left with nothing to stand on. His university tuition had gone long past due, and his father had quietly taken out substantial debt in his name, a detail he was only now piecing together. His voice was unsteady as he arrived at the question I had been expecting since he walked up that driveway. He asked if I could lend him money, just a modest amount, he said, enough to cover his most pressing debts and keep him from losing his campus apartment. He would pay back every cent once he was out of school and earning. I didn't pause. I set my mug down on the small table beside the swing, met his eyes directly and told him no, not a single cent in cash. Mason pulled back as if something had struck him. He started to open his mouth to push back or plead, but I raised one hand and he stopped. Handing over money, I told him, was the identical mistake I had made with his father. Unconditional financial cushioning was a slow poison. It had made his father into an idle, entitled man who believed the world was obligated to provide for him. I cared about Mason too much to pass that same infection along. I was not going to produce a check and rob him of the chance to discover what he was actually made of. I reached down beside the swing and lifted a plain craft folder. I held it out. He took it with both hands, still trembling slightly, and opened it. Inside was a legally binding contract I had drawn up with Graham early that morning. I laid out the terms without softening them. My foundation would pay his university tuition directly to the school. Not a dollar of it would pass through his hands or appear in his account. In return, he was required to work 20 hours a week as a clerk at the $150 trust. He would be filing paperwork, answering phones, and directly serving the elderly victims his parents had so ruthlessly looked down upon. I told him he would earn a standard hourly wage, and that specific wage would cover his own rent, his own food, and his own debts. No luxury cars, no designer clothes, and not a single free ride. Mason read through the document carefully. I watched his face, waiting to see whether the toxic pride his mother had bred into him would suddenly ignite. I waited to see if he would throw the folder down and storm off in anger, insulted by the prospect of working an honest job, but he didn't. Instead, a deep and overwhelming calm settled over his tired features. His entire life, his parents had wielded money like a weapon, buying his loyalty, manipulating his choices, keeping him comfortably snared in their web of deception. This contract was something else entirely. It was an honest, unforgiving line in the sand. It was a chance to build something real by his own hand. With his chin lifted, Mason looked up from the page, his eyes carrying a quiet new resolve. He asked me for a pen. I pulled the black fountain pen from my shirt pocket and handed it over. He pressed the folder flat against the wooden porch railing and signed his name at the bottom without a moment's hesitation. The line was definitively drawn, and the foundation of a real family was finally laid. 6 months passed with the relentless, unstoppable force of a freight train. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing out the frenzied noise of the press gathered on the front marble steps. The courtroom was filled to capacity journalists, former investors, and curious onlookers all crowded in to witness the final act of the city's most notorious family betrayal. I sat in the polished wooden chair of the witness stand, calmly adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. Across the wide aisle at the stark metal defense table sat Derek and Camille. They bore no resemblance to the arrogant corporate royalty who had swept down the red carpet half a year before. Their bespoke suits and sapphire gowns had been stripped away, replaced by dull, oversized, standard-issue prison jumpsuits. Derek looked completely hollowed out. His posture had caved inward. His complexion was ashen, his eyes skittering nervously around the imposing room. I looked at him and felt not a single ounce of pity. No surge of furious anger either. What I felt was the pristine, freezing clarity of a man delivering consequences that were long overdue. The prosecuting attorney stepped up to the witness stand and asked me to state my name for the official record. I leaned toward the microphone and spoke with cold, unwavering precision. For the next 2 hours, I answered every question they put to me. I laid out the exact timeline of events, mapping the full history of their deceit, without shedding a single tear, without a tremor in my voice, without any show of emotional weakness. The defense attorney tried to shake me, pushing the narrative that I was a vindictive billionaire nursing a petty grudge. But my composure was absolute iron. I did not give my son the satisfaction of watching me crack. I set out the cold, hard facts of his betrayal and let the sheer brutality of his own actions carry the weight. The prosecutor then turned from the defense table and crossed to the jury box, signaling the court clerk to fire up the large evidence projector. He didn't limit himself to the $4 million embezzlement that had brought the federal agents to the gala. He went far deeper. He surfaced documents from 15 years ago. The glowing screen behind the judge lit up with the original deed to my old suburban home, placed side by side with the power of attorney paperwork that had authorized the secret sale. The prosecutor then displayed a verified forensic analysis of the signatures at a microscopic level. The forgery was undeniable. I explained to the silent, breathless courtroom exactly how Derek had engineered the theft. I described how he had slipped those specific pages into a thick stack of hospital bills and insurance forms, while I was heavily medicated, completely numb, and deep in mourning for my late wife. I watched the faces of the 12 jurors as they absorbed the full depravity of what he had done. Several of them physically recoiled, their expressions twisting in undisguised disgust. They saw the calculated predatory forgery from a decade and a half ago, set alongside the fresh bank statements tracing his stolen investor funds. The full pattern of his staggering greed was laid bare for the world to judge. He had been a ruthless thief his entire adult life, stealing first from a grieving father and finally from the people who had trusted his business with their money. Derek sank lower in his chair, unable to meet the screen, unable to face the jury, and wholly unable to look at me. The trial did not drag on. The paper trail was far too overwhelming, the digital evidence too devastatingly damning to contest. When the jury foreman rose to read the verdict, the tension in the room was suffocating. Guilty on all charges. The words rang through the silent courtroom like a heavy steel vault door slamming shut forever. The federal judge, a stern, unyielding woman with zero patience for white-collar criminals, did not hold back at sentencing. She looked directly down from the bench at Derek and Camille, her voice sharp with unmistakable contempt. She condemned their conduct as a sickening display of profound moral bankruptcy, noting that they had turned family trust into a financial weapon for personal gain. She raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, echoing crack. She sentenced them both to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. 15 years. It was a perfectly poetic, devastating symmetry, 1 year behind bars for every single year I had spent rebuilding my life from the ashes they had left me in. Derek did not cry out. He did not scream or thrash against the bailiffs the way he had at the charity gala. He simply dropped his head, his forehead coming to rest against the cold metal of the defense table. His shoulders gave way as the crushing, agonizing reality finally broke through. The terrifying arithmetic of his own greed was playing out behind his eyes. He had thrown away a guaranteed inheritance in a billion-dollar biotechnology empire. He had forfeited wealth beyond anything he could have imagined, all because he was too impatient, too exceptionally greedy to earn $2 million honestly. He had sacrificed his freedom, driven away his only son, and demolished his entire future for absolutely nothing. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom as the bailiffs stepped forward. They seized Derek by the arms and hauled him to his feet, ready to take him away. He cast one final broken look back toward the witness stand, but I was already turning away perfectly at peace with the justice that had finally arrived. The visitor room of the federal penitentiary was a masterpiece of sterile, depressing architecture. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing the rows of scratched plastic chairs and thick reinforced plexiglass dividers in a sickly pale glow. I sat perfectly still in my designated seat waiting. I felt no anxiety. My pulse was as steady as the ticking of a grandfather clock. I wasn't there to offer forgiveness or hunt for closure. I was there to place a final, definitive period at the end of a very long sentence. The heavy steel door on the far side of the room buzzed and clicked open. A correctional officer guided my son into the visitor area. I watched Derek move toward the glass, and for a fleeting moment it was hard to reconcile the man in front of me with the arrogant, polished real estate mogul from 6 months ago. The bespoke charcoal tuxedo had been swapped for an oversized faded khaki jumpsuit. His posture was completely broken, his shoulders curved inward, his hair thinning unkempt and going gray at the temples. The crushing weight of a 15-year federal sentence had aged him a decade in just a few short months. He lowered himself heavily onto the metal stool on his side of the glass. With trembling hands, he reached out and picked up the black plastic telephone receiver. I mirrored the gesture, lifting the handset to my ear. For a long moment, nothing passed between us but the harsh sound of his uneven breathing. He stared at me through the smudged plexiglass, his eyes red and bloodshot. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you for coming. I did not think you would ever want to see me again." I stayed completely silent, letting his words hang in the sterile air. The silence pressed down on him and forced him to keep talking to fill the void with the speech he had undoubtedly rehearsed alone in his cell. He leaned toward the glass, resting his forehead against the barrier. "I am so sorry," he cried, his voice soaked in a desperate, pathetic sorrow. "I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I lost everything, Dad. I lost my company, my wife, my son. I sit in that cell every single night, thinking about what I did to you. I just want you to know how deeply sorry I am." I took in every word of that apology. It landed like an empty vessel, no genuine remorse underneath any of it. This was the contrition of a man grieving his own capture, not someone haunted by the wreckage he had left behind. My expression never moved. I gave him a wall of stone and nothing else. The moment he understood that weeping wasn't going to find a crack in me, he cleared his face and rearranged himself in his seat. The grief he'd performed dissolved on contact, and something older and more familiar crept in to fill the space. That bottomless predatory hunger at his core, it could never stay masked for long. "It is so hard in here, Dad." The register of his voice slid without friction from remorse straight into grievance. "The food is completely inedible. The conditions are terrible. I have absolutely nothing left. They stripped all of my accounts. Mason won't even answer my letters. I am completely alone." He swallowed. He went quiet for a beat, eyes fixed on me with the look of a man calculating his odds. He stammered out a request, just one small thing, really. A modest deposit to his prison commissary account. Enough to cover decent food, basic necessities, the bare minimum. "You have billions, Dad. A few hundred would mean absolutely nothing to you, but it would change my entire life in here." And there it was, stripped bare, undeniable. The truest portrait of the man my son had always been. After 15 years in a federal penitentiary, after a conviction for massive financial fraud that had obliterated everything he owned, the very first thing he did when he sat across from the father he had robbed was put out his hand. Greed like that isn't a choice. It's a disease written into the marrow. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even acknowledge the audacity of the ask. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew a small silver money clip. Moving with deliberate, unhurried calm, I peeled two particular bills loose from the clip. I raised them so they sat just shy of the plexiglass, clear and legible under the cold fluorescent glare above us. One crisp 100 bill and one crisp $50 bill. Derek fell silent, his face tightened brow, drawn down in baffled concentration. He watched me crease the bills into a neat fold. Then I pressed forward and fed them through the narrow transaction slot, cut into the base of the glass barrier. They emerged on his side and lay still on the metal shelf between us. Derek's gaze dropped to the money. It climbed back to my face, his eyes searching frantically for something, anything that would make sense of this. Why, the word barely made it out of him. Why exactly 150? The black plastic receiver stayed pressed to my ear. Because, Derek, I said, my voice carrying no heat whatsoever, nothing but bedrock certainty. That is exactly what you left me. I could see it hit him before he could stop it. His mind fell backward 15 years down to a cold, deserted driveway, the changed locks, the loaded car pulling out of sight. A grieving old man left standing with a crumpled handful of cash and a handwritten note telling him to sort it out himself. The elegance of that arithmetic destroyed him where he sat. He stared at the 150 on the metal shelf, and the full scope of everything, every public disgrace, every private humiliation, broke over him all at once, a wave with no shore to stop it. This wasn't charity. It was a reckoning. It held a mirror up to him and made him look. Derek pressed both hands over his face and came apart, heaving uncontrollable sobs, the kind that have no audience in mind. These weren't manufactured tears. This was shame with nowhere left to hide grief for a sentence of 15 years that had finally irrevocably become real to him. I didn't leave him with a single word of kindness. I eased the receiver back onto its hook, and the sound of him crying disappeared. I pushed up out of my seat, fastened my jacket button, squared my frame, and walked toward the heavy steel exit without a backward glance. My spine was straight. I moved through the door completely unburdened by the ghost of the son I used to know. The last cord connecting me to decades of thankless love had been cut clean, and I carried no pity out with me. 2 years passed the way good years do, with the quiet, unhurried steadiness of a life running at last on its own honest fuel. I was in the front row of a vast, sun-drenched university stadium on a warm graduation morning, the air charged with something bright and restless. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, hands folded in my lap. No corporate identity, no philanthropist's badge. Just a grandfather with a seat in the front row, waiting on a young man who had clawed his way back from nothing. Out on the field, a tide of black caps and gowns filled every row. Mason was somewhere in that sea. He bore no resemblance whatsoever to the shattered, terrified boy who had sunk to his knees on the hotel marble 2 years before. The change in him was total. He had put in 20 grueling hours a week, processing paperwork at my foundation alongside a punishing academic schedule. Rent, groceries, tuition, all of it handled with his own earnings, not a cent borrowed from me since the afternoon we pressed our signatures to that contract on my front porch. A hush settled over the stadium as the university dean stepped up to the wooden podium to introduce the valedictorian speaker. When Mason's name came through the speakers, something moved through my chest like a slow tide. He rose and crossed to the stage with an easy, grounded confidence nothing performed about it. He set the microphone and lifted his eyes to the crowd. He said nothing about his mother, said nothing about his father, or the scandal, or the prison sentences that had leveled his former life. What he talked about was accountability, the crushing, clarifying pressure of the real world, and what it actually costs to stand free inside it. His hands found the edges of the podium, and his voice carried clean and firm across the stadium. The greatest thing he had ever been taught, he told those thousands of people hadn't arrived in a lecture hall or between the covers of a textbook. It had arrived in the shape of a wide push broom and a crumpled 150. He described how seductive the illusion of privilege is, how thoroughly inherited wealth can blind a person to their own fragility. Real survival, he said, has nothing to do with who shows up to pull you out of the hole. True survival is about finding the absolute internal strength to stand back up on your own 2 feet when nobody else is coming to save you. He let the words settle, then looked down from the stage directly into my eyes. The stadium stilled around that moment. He told the crowd the man who had rescued him hadn't done it with a generous check or a soft, reassuring word. He'd done it with a line that didn't move and an expectation that didn't bend. A real smile, unhurried, unforced, crossed his face as he told them that the person who showed him what a dollar honestly earned is worth and what self-respect actually feels like was his grandfather. The noise that followed was enormous. I sat with it rolling over me, a warmth settling deep in my chest that had nothing to do with applause. I kept my hands still in my lap. I didn't shout, but what I felt in that moment outweighed every boardroom win, every business triumph I had ever stacked up across a lifetime. The boy had finally become a man. When the ceremony released everyone onto the sunlit grass, the lawns became a cheerful disorder of families' photographs and embraces. I held my spot near the stage and waited. Mason came through the crowd, moving in a straight-line diploma in his right hand, eyes already on me. He stopped when we were face to face. No long speech passed between us, no elaborate declaration. None was needed. What we shared was the kind of understanding that only exists between two people who have required something real of each other and both delivered. A fellow student paused nearby and offered to snap a photo. Mason and I stood together, shoulders level, facing the lens. I didn't arrange my face into anything polished or deliberate. For the first time in more than 15 years, a smile came to me on its own, genuine, unhurried, all the way up into my eyes. Standing next to that young man, I understood that the wreckage of a poisoned family had finally been scattered to the wind. What remained in its place was something built from the ground up, honesty, hard limits, and a love that had been genuinely earned rather than purchased. I made my way back to the quiet retreat of my private study at the very top of the city. The broad, polished walnut desk sat nearly bare, a single thick leather-bound folder centered on its surface. Graham waited near the heavy wooden doors, slim leather attaché in hand. He said nothing as I crossed to the desk and opened the folder. It was the comprehensive annual impact report for the $150 trust. I drew my hand across the crisp pages, letting the full scale of what we had assembled over the previous 24 months settle over me. The figures on that heavy paper were staggering to absorb. The foundation had fully funded aggressive legal defense teams for more than 3,000 elderly people across the country. These were men and women being actively defrauded, manipulated, and bullied by their own relatives, the people who were supposed to protect them. I read through the briefing summaries, account after account, of how our network of relentless corporate attorneys had frozen illegal asset transfers and clawed back stolen retirement savings. We had contested forged powers of attorney and put hundreds of predatory family members behind bars. One case described a 70-year-old widow locked out of her own home by her daughter. Our rapid legal intervention meant she was sleeping safely in her own bed that night, while her daughter sat waiting for a federal trial date. The meager sum my son had dropped on that kitchen counter had grown into an unstoppable engine of pure, unrelenting justice. I shut the leather-bound folder and felt something heavy lift from my frame. I crossed slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The late afternoon sun was dragging long golden shadows across the city skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of copper and amber. Gazing out over the vast grid of streets, I felt a stillness anchored so deep inside me it was almost physical. For 15 years, I had carried my son's betrayal like a stone pressed against my chest. Sleepless nights stretched out before me, and I spent them staring at the ceiling and asking myself where I had failed him. I used to torment myself over how the child I raised had hardened into something so cold and calculating, willing to leave his own father with nothing. But standing at that window watching the light drain from the skyline, I finally saw the truth plainly. That corruption was never mine to own. Greed is its own disease, insidious and self-chosen. I didn't make Derek into the man he became. I didn't manufacture some petty emotional payback. What I did was pull away the cushion of my wealth and hold a mirror large enough that neither of them could look away from what they truly were. I let the consequences they had, carefully laid out for me, land squarely on them instead. The diseased branches of my family tree had been cut away without sentiment or hesitation. Because of that painful but necessary severance, the roots beneath were finally free to grow. The fortune Derek had clawed at so desperately was now standing as an unbreakable defense for thousands of invisible people with no one else in their corner. Graham moved quietly to stand beside me at the glass, looking out at the diminishing light. He had been my sharpest instrument and my most steadfast ally through the worst of this fight. He reached into his slim leather attaché and drew out a single clean sheet of paper, setting it at the near edge of the polished walnut desk. He looked at me with measured professional regard and asked whether I had reached my final decision about the board of directors, whether I was truly prepared to put my name to the corporate transition documents and step away entirely as active chief executive of my biotechnology company. I turned from the window and looked down at the single dotted line waiting on the page. My entire adult life had been spent constructing, accumulating, battling to hold ground in a world that punishes any sign of weakness. I had beaten physical disease in the laboratory. I had excised the toxic elements from my own family. My legacy was secured, and my grandson was pointed toward an honest, self-made future. There were no more wars left on my calendar, no more empires left to erect. I reached into my jacket's inner pocket, withdrew my black fountain pen, and brought it down against the paper. My name came out in a single unbroken stroke, and as the ink dried, a quiet and complete sense of closure moved through the room. I capped the pen, slipped it back into my pocket, and turned to Graham. I told him the paperwork was done and the transfer of power was final. I fastened my jacket button and took one last look at the horizon. I told him I had spent 74 years surviving, building, and guarding what I made from people who wanted to take it. Then I let a calm, unhurried smile cross my face and told him that the time for all of that was over. Now, at last, I intended to live. The soft, rhythmic click of my fishing rod was the only thing punctuating the stillness of the late afternoon. I sat on a weathered wooden bench at the edge of a quiet, secluded lake, well beyond the reach of the glass towers and the city's grinding noise. The setting sun poured a long copper warmth across the water, catching the gentle movement of the surface and lighting my face. I could feel every deep line around my eyes, every crease the years had pressed into my skin. But for the first time in 15 years, those lines weren't the work of sleepless nights or suffocating grief. They had settled into something else entirely, peace, the real, unperformed kind. My phone lay on the wooden dock beside my tackle box, the screen dark and perfectly silent. No notifications demanding attention, no desperate voicemails from a son begging for a $2 million rescue from the consequences of his own making. No hollow declarations of love engineered to soften me up for the next ask. The noise that had torn through my life was gone, cut off permanently without apology. The air out here was sharp and clean, untouched by the hunger of a man who had seen his own father as little more than a balance sheet with an expiration date. I sent my line out across the water and watched the small red bobber settle on the glassy surface. Then I drew a slow breath and let my mind travel the full distance between who I was and who I am now. 15 years ago, I was a man discarded standing on a cold concrete driveway, with nothing, a grieving widower who had been cast aside like something worn out and worthless, expected to disappear quietly and make things tidy for those who came after. My son and his wife read my silence as surrender. They took my devastation as evidence that I was finished. What they failed to account for was the one truth that had defined me every day of my adult life. I do not lay down and quit. I didn't merely endure the game they forced on me. I tore it apart. I took control of the board, reset every piece, and rewrote the rules they thought were permanent. I took the deepest wound a parent can be handed and turned it into a shield wide enough to cover thousands of people the world had chosen to forget. I didn't want noise or spectacle. I simply raised the mirror high enough that their own greed consumed them completely. My grandson Mason sits today at a modest metal desk in the city, drawing an honest hourly wage. He pays his rent, manages his own accounts, and is building something real with his own hands. On weekends, he comes to this very dock not for money, but to sit beside me and talk about his coursework, his struggles, the wins he actually earned. He broke the cycle that could have swallowed him because I refused to hand him a rescue he hadn't worked for. I lost a son to greed's final stage, but I pulled my grandson back from that edge by offering him the one thing his parents never could, the unvarnished, demanding truth of reality. I drew the line in, slowly feeling the satisfying pull of the gears. Far from this peaceful water at the heart of the financial district, the grand marble lobby of my foundation stands open. Every single day, thousands of people pass through those glass doors, looking for the same shelter from financial predators that I once needed so desperately myself. They walk through those doors shattered and afraid, and they walk out shielded by a battalion of relentless corporate attorneys. Right at the heart of that vast lobby, resting on a polished black granite pedestal, sits a small reinforced glass display case. Inside that case, lit from above, rests a crumpled $100 bill, a single $50 bill, and a faded yellow slip of paper. The handwriting hurried, and Blunt is still perfectly legible. You will figure it out. That piece of paper no longer lives hidden in my private study. It belongs to the world now. It stands as a permanent, immortal monument to every entitled, grasping child who imagines they can steal from the parents who brought them into existence and simply disappear without consequence. It stands equally as a silent guardian for the elderly, a reminder that no one is obligated to absorb abuse from the people who happen to share their blood. I gazed out across the quiet lake as the sun slipped below the dark tree line and the sky opened into deep shades of violet and blue. A cool evening breeze moved across my face, carrying pine and something that tasted like freedom. I leaned back on my wooden bench, carrying none of the weight that used to press down on me. Let that small yellow scrap of paper serve as a permanent warning to anyone who looks at a quiet old man and sees an easy mark. The silence of a betrayed father or a cast-aside grandfather is not surrender. It is not a confession of weakness or a quiet acceptance of what's been done to him. It is the deep, heavy stillness that arrives before the storm breaks. It is patient preparation, the kind that precedes the moment when the natural order finally corrects itself. The greatest thing this ordeal taught me is that shared blood does not entitle anyone to a lifetime of disrespect or manipulation. Family is meant to be a foundation you can stand on, not a fertile ground for entitlement and betrayal. When someone reveals their true character by discarding you at your most vulnerable, the most important thing you can do is trust what they've shown you. If this story reached something inside you today, I am glad you stayed until the end. This one cost me something to tell, even in the retelling, because the wound that a child can leave in a parent runs deep in a way that very few words can fully reach. I spent 15 years carrying the weight of what Derek did. 15 years of sleepless nights of wondering whether the silence I chose made me weak. What I learned slowly, painfully, is that walking away from toxic blood is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of courage there is. I believe God does not waste a single broken thing. Not a crumpled $100 bill, not a handwritten note that was meant to bury you, not a single year spent rebuilding in the dark. Every bit of it had a purpose. Here is what I would want you to carry with you from this story. First, when someone shows you who they truly are, believe them, even when believing them hurts. Second, the silence of a patient person is never surrender. It is preparation. Third, your suffering, if you refuse to let it rot, can become a shield for someone else who has no one fighting for them. Fourth, an honest dollar earned with your own hands will always outweigh a fortune handed to you by someone who expects something in return. These are the kinds of father stories that don't make the evening news, but they happen every single day in quiet houses, in prison visitor rooms, and college stadiums across this country. And grandpa revenge stories like this one exist not to celebrate bitterness, but to remind us that dignity once lost can be rebuilt, and that the people who tried to take it from you may live long enough to understand exactly what they threw away. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling me what stayed with you. And if you have not yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, now is a good time. There are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.